Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Welcome to Never Mind the Dambusters, the podcast that goes beyond the myths, the movies and the legends of our from Vermont. I'm Jane Gulford-Lowes and I'm joined as ever by my co-host James Jeffries. Together we uncover the untold stories, the hard choices and the moral complexities behind one of the most powerful and most controversial air forces of the Second World War. This is not just a tale of aircraft and missions, but of politics, people and a legacy that still provokes debate today. We also highlight new perspectives on resistance and survival. Today, we discuss a fantastic new book called Operation Pimento, a gripping story of tragedy, escape, evasion, memory and resolution, involving courage of the French resistance, Maquis, and the shadow of Franco's fascists. And LD Halifax's, of course. What more could you want? As the author says in his introduction, the story has ingredients of a screenplay that could have been written by Lord Flashheart himself. So join us as we navigate the turbulence of history and reveal why the story of Bomber Command is far more complex and fascinating than the legend suggests. So before I introduce our guest today, a quick catch-up. How are you, James, and how was the conference at Imperial War Museum, Duxford last weekend?
I'm good, yeah. Hello, everybody. You always write such wonderful introductions. I love your scripts, Joan. But yeah, before that, I want to mention that I was on Fighting on Film talking about the Bomber Harris docudrama that starred John Thor. A lot of time for the boys there. Absolutely fantastic time and really enjoyed discussing that. But yeah, the weekend... Wow, what a couple of days. How do I sum this up in a couple of minutes? So it was the IWM History Festival at the Imperial War Museum, Duxford. And I mean, there were speakers, including myself and Sarah Louise Miller. But there was also Peter Caddick Adams, Jenny Grant, Claire Mulley. Sir Richard Evans was there as well. But a massive shout out for all the amazing staff there putting it on and the hard work. So me and Sarah, obviously good friend and former guest of the pod, brilliant historian. We were talking about the Lancaster and operations, Manor and Exodus on both days. We did get a question about the Halifax, and obviously we're going to be talking about the Halifax today. I channeled my inner Jane. You would have been proud of my answer. I said, yes, it does need, absolutely, it needs more attention, as do the crews. It shouldn't be overshadowed by the Lancaster. And that also mentioned Whitley's, Wellington's et al. I did you proud, Jane. I'm sure. But what a place, Imperial War Museum in Duxford. We were based in the control tower, and me and Sarah went up just to prep for the talk with a couple of other people. As we were there, I kid you not, a 109 came past with smoke trailing from it, chased by a Spitfire. So we saw that it was 109. It was a Bouchon, And it was just, you couldn't make it up. And all day there were Spitfires taking off. There was a Mark 1 that you could go up to, as well as so many other aircraft. We saw P-47 flying over, and gosh, I've got a bit of a soft spot for that aircraft. And yeah, there was a Blenheim cockpit there too. And Jamie Heffer, again, friend of the podcast, been on the show a couple of times now. He sat in it. Oh, I love Jamie. I've got so much time. And we had a great time catching up and talking, chewing the fat about aviation and all sorts, watching all of these old vintage aircraft take off. But one of the best things, and it was like a dream, this whole thing, was I arrived on day 2 and I saw a Hurricane coming into land, and I recognised it from quite some distance. I had my glasses on. You just know the sound as well when you hear these old vintage aircraft. And it came into land. And it was like, wow, what an intro to day 2. But that's not the end of it. It taxied up and parked next to the Bristol Blenheim. So my 2 favourite aircraft were there right next to each other. And I took a snap and I went, wow, good omen to the day. But again, it doesn't end there. We find out that the Blenheim's going to take off at some point, and I'm going, I bet it's during the talk. And it takes off just as we're about to go on to do the talk. Like, I can't hide my excitement. I'm there going, I'm going to play it cool. Of course I don't. I'm looking out the window going, oh my goodness, there it is, What, I mean, that'll never happen again. I'll start a talk with the Bristol Blenheim flying past. It was just, amazing. But yeah, very, very quickly, spoke to so many folks there, so many friends. And we met a few listeners who passed on their thanks for the show. And thank you. It was lovely to meet you. If you're listening now, massive thank you. I also spoke to Derek from the Polish Heritage Flight, who's also a listener. He says that he listens regularly, enjoys it. Got up close with the DH9 and Hawker Fury, and that was fun, sort of looking at aircraft development. And we had absolutely brilliant chat. And very finally, I now own a spark plug from a Blenheim. And I'm thinking maybe this could be the start of building a full-size one. But yeah, what a weekend. Yeah, what a weekend. How you been, Jane? I am, there are many listening. I know that.
Green with envy here. I am. I'm so gutted I couldn't attend and come on the panel with you and Sarah Lou. But yeah, just other end of the country to me. So unfortunately, just couldn't make it. But it sounds absolutely fantastic. What an incredible
It was
event.
incredible.
Just hopefully I'll make it next year. I have to say, I must confess, I've still never been to Oxford. It's like
we got to get you there. We've got to get you there.
It's so hard to get there from here.
I
need to move.
Yeah.
I need to move house to be near all these things that are going on. Anyway, right, let's crack on. So I'm delighted to welcome onto the show today Adam Hart, the author of Operation Pimento. I've had the pleasure of reading Adam's book, and I have to say the story is an absolute belter, featuring characters who would be at home in an episode of Secret Army or even Allo Allo. Adam, can we first begin by explaining to our listeners what Operation Pimento actually was, your connection to the story, and how you came to write this fantastic book?
Sure, yeah. Well, thanks very much for having me, both of you. So Operation Pimento, so this was an operation my great-grandfather was given in August 1943. He was a squadron leader in the RAF in 138 Squadron. We're a special duties squadron based at RAF Tempsford. So doing all sorts of cloak and dagger missions, they called it, flying to occupied Europe and dropping supplies for the resistance and war material, and also infiltrating SOE agents, lots of exciting, terrifying missions like that. And one of these was Operation Pimento, which basically concerned the Allies' invasion of Italy in September 1943, that Frank was tasked with dropping supplies, most importantly explosives, to blow up rail tunnels linking France and Italy through the Alps, because the Allies knew once the invasion in Italy in Salerno kicked off, German reinforcements would come down from France into Italy to try and push the Allies back into the sea. So basically, Frank was going to drop these containers, these explosives, these war material, and Maquis group in the area, in the Haute-Savoie area of France, would blow up the tunnels and slow up the German advance into German reinforcements coming into Italy. My connection to the story is obviously through Frank being my great-grandfather, but I never really knew the specifics at all of it, or what he was doing, or even what the name of the operation was, or anything when he was shot down. I just grew up knowing that he was shot down and had this amazing escape, and was very lucky to escape with his life. And so it was just sort of a distant figure. He died 4 years before I was born, 96, but always, a hero in the family, like a family legend, and everybody kind of knew the story. But emphasis on the kinda, that he was a sort of RAF hero, had this amazing story, but nobody really knew the ins and outs, as it were. And I had this amazing, lucky chance to actually delve into this so much more by going out to the crash site and retracing his subsequent escape. I was in my final year at university, and I won a travel journalism bursary to go and retrace it and to write about it. So I went out aiming to write, I'd been commissioned to write one 1,000-word article. And here we are 2.5 years later with a 80,000-word book published, which is just absolutely crazy. I never, ever thought that would happen. Definitely got a bit out of hand. And yeah, I guess that's how I came to write the book, really.
I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about Frank's background and how he ended up with 138 Squadron at Tempsford, and maybe if there is anything more to talk about the role of that squadron and the special duties.
Sure, yeah, that's actually, I'm glad you've asked that, because I've literally just read a book about RAF Tempsford.
Oh,
so
brilliant.
Hopefully I'll actually have something intelligent to say. But Frank, he joined the RAF a couple of years before the war started. He's quite an interesting character because he was 24 when he joined, but between school, 18, and 24, he basically kind of dropped out of society in a way. He was from the sort of North Wales, Wirral, Liverpool area, and he when he left school, he had no idea what he wanted to do. So he decided to buy a shrimping boat and build a cabin on it and live on it with his dog. And he spent the summers basically sailing around North Wales and fishing and sleeping on beaches and living this kind of vagabond lifestyle. And then in the winters, he'd moor up in Liverpool docks and work as a labourer in Liverpool, which is quite a very interesting choice in 1930s, when gap years didn't really exist. And, and he had quite a privileged upbringing. He had gone to private school and obviously would not have been the done thing at all for someone of his background. But anyway, he does eventually end up in the RAF. And it was sort of been the making of him, and he saw it as what he really wanted to do in life was to fly. He was very much adrenaline junkie. And I can imagine him as a 24-year-old, absolutely loving flying and the thrills that come with it. His first squadron he was posted to was 6-2 Squadron. He was a Blenheim pilot and only on a short service commission. But unfortunately for him at the time, they were all posted to Malaya at the very start of the war in September 39, which he and all of his friends were absolutely gutted about. And he's left this writing behind saying how they all applied to be sent back to the UK to take part, but they were all denied. Anyway, so he starts off the war in Malaya. He's there for a year and a half. An old back injury of his flares up while he's there, and he's sent home unfit for duties, back to England for treatment. He's fixed in England, comes out of hospital late 1940, and the RAF send him to this really interesting establishment called the TRE, which I think is the Telecommunications Research Establishment, which sounds incredibly boring, but it's actually really interesting. And basically, he was a very gifted pilot, and he was sent there to test all sorts of navigational aids and flight modifications to aircraft and anything that basically gives the RAF parity with the Luftwaffe and hopefully an advantage technologically. Especially things like like airborne radar, all sorts of stuff like that. So it's really interesting flying, certainly not, although not operational, certainly not without danger, but incredibly important, I think, as well, given what it produced for Bomber Command and aviation in general. Anyway, April 1943, Frank decided that despite flying, I think, over 50 aircraft types at this point, multiple sorties a day, 6 days a week, still having friends being killed in accidents in TRE, he decided he hadn't done enough for the war effort, and he felt guilty that he hadn't been operational at all because in Malaya, Japan hadn't entered the war yet. So he applied to be sent to a operational squadron. And I don't know if he chose 138 Squadron or if he just ended up there. I'm not sure how his path there. But anyway, classic Frank, he ended up at this really interesting special duties squadron, as it was called, of which 138 was one and the other being 161. And they were both based at RAF Tempsford, this fascinating airfield in Bedfordshire. Barely anything left of it now. But this really was the sort of operating arm of the SOE, and the SOE, all of their agents would have passed through, nearly all of their agents would have passed through Tempsford on their way into Europe, as well as vast sums of money and war material, etc., all dropped in by these air crews at Tempsford, who only flew in the brightest moon periods, alone, really low altitude, incredibly brave, daring flying, and often didn't come home. That's who Frank was flying for, and he got to his 16th mission when Operation Pimento came through.
Can you tell us a little bit about Frank's crew, Adam, and the aircraft that they were flying?
Sure, yeah. So his crew, he had 6 crew on board that night in Operation Pimento. They had an average age of 23, which is pretty terrifyingly young, but I know common in the RAF in wartime. 2 years younger than I am now, and I get nervous trying to join the motorway on the slip road. So to be doing a special duties operation over Europe is just pretty mind-boggling. They're from all over the UK. One was from the Isle of Skye. The navigator was from Devon, Middlesbrough, Bury, so all over the place.
And it's in August that the crew come to grief, isn't it? I mean, did you want to tell us a little bit about what happens, the circumstances of the crash, and also Frank's survival.
Yeah, absolutely. So the crew take off on this mission. It's all going well. They navigate to the drop site pretty perfectly in the Haute-Savoie near Annecy, which is this lovely city in the Alps, which has quite a big alpine lake next to it. And so they arrive at the drop zone outside of Annecy, and they're all searching for the reception party torches on the ground or bonfires, but they can't find them, and they're flying around Annecy in the middle of the night, in occupied France. So they vulnerable, very low altitude, and flying up and down Lake Annecy as well, which on a moonlit night must have been absolutely beautiful, but also very scary to be in an aircraft, to be in a Halifax aircraft, a huge 4-engine aircraft. If you imagine the, high Alps on either side of you, any sort of trouble with your engines and you're going to be in a lot of trouble. Yeah. And as Frank recalls, as being the only survivor, one minute they're circling around Annecy and the lake looking for this reception party, and faster than it takes, to read in his memoir, he loses one engine, loses second engine on the same wing, aircraft won't climb, stuck in a permanent downwards turn. Obviously, there's no time to parachute, no altitude to parachute, and the aircraft's coming down and it's going to crash, and it's just a matter of where it's going to crash. And unfortunately, it crashes straight into this little village called Mette, which is now a suburb of Annecy. And the photos are quite chilling to see, actually, and it is utter destruction. Basically totally destroys 3 houses and starts this terrible, terrible fire from all the fuel on board the Halifax and the explosives and ammunition. 5 local French people in their houses are killed, including a mother and her 2 children, 3 and 1. It's real tragedy for this little village, and you can still feel it today when you go out there. That's still a big thing for them in their sort of collective memory. And there's various different sources on what happened to the crew. I think, from my judgment, I think they were all killed pretty much instantly. They actually afterwards said that they couldn't identify any remains, basically, so they just buried them in a communal grave. And then later, after the war, were able to say, okay, well, it must have been, these were the men who were killed. So it was a terrible, terrible, devastating crash. And somehow Frank survives. He was obviously the pilot being in the cockpit. Again, this was his recollection. It honestly is beyond belief, but I guess it does make sense. But basically, as the aircraft hit these buildings and began to break up, he says he was catapulted through his cockpit, still actually strapped into his seat, into the night sky, and he became entangled in telephone wires, which basically broke his fall. And rather than hitting the ground or a building and presumably being killed straight away, he was suspended in these wires. And he wrote that he remembers regaining consciousness in the wires and feeling this terrible heat of fire behind it and flailing around, and then realizing he was still being held in place by his harness. So he released his harness and fell a distance to the ground and broke his shoulder and his wrist and knocked himself out again. So he was pretty badly injured, and obviously all the cuts and bruises as well of going through a Halifax windscreen.
Yeah.
And anyway, he regains consciousness on the floor, staggers up and was like bleeding and vomiting and not in a good way at all. And passes out again, comes to again. He sets off up this hill, basically just wants to get away from the fire. Obviously must have been in a blind panic, which is when a 14-year-old French boy cycles up to him on his bike and says, Are you English? Frank says, yes. And he says, come with me. I'm going to hide you. And that's where the start of the escape story begins.
Wow. That's just absolutely, even that alone in itself is absolutely staggering, isn't it? Now, I was amazed to learn that Frank actually watched the funeral of his crewmates, didn't he? I can't even begin to imagine how traumatized as well as physically injured he must have been at this point. But this is only the beginning of Frank's story, as you've pointed out, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. He's so difficult to comprehend a lot of this story. But yeah, he's this French boy takes him away and hides him. He's given first aid, and basically the local resistance aroused, and they take him away to a safe house, which is basically a brothel, which turns out is actually a really good place to hide downed airmen, despite the fact that the German and Italian soldiers actually come to the brothel. But I suppose that's why they might not suspect them of hiding an airman. And anyway, he spends 3 days in this safe house, being looked after by these incredible French people, just ordinary French people. And then they move him because they've got word the Italians are coming for him. By the way, this little corner of France was actually occupied by Italy, not by Germany, in summer of 1943. And it's on this hilltop behind this safe house where he sort of witnesses the funeral of his crew. By this point, the local resistance leader has told him that he thinks they've all been killed in the crash. So he must have been coming to terms with that, and obviously still very physically and mentally very scarred. And he writes sitting on this sort of hilltop lookout in the Mackey, as it were, the Mackey name coming from like a rough scrub that people can hide in. Anyway, he sat in the Mackey with the Mackey, and he hears the church bells ringing out and the funeral procession going through the town. And again, it must have been incredibly moving. Like, there's some amazing eyewitness testimonies that have survived of it down in the village. Everyone in the village, like hundreds and hundreds of people, had turned out to try come to this funeral. And the Italians were trying to just bury the men with no military honours and just get it over with quickly. And all the locals were like shouting at them and like demanding they wanted to bury them themselves and like give them military honours and a proper burial and all sorts. And eventually the Italians, after threatening to shoot into the crowd, give up and go home, and the French people flood in and do it all themselves and bury it with flowers and erect this amazing grave. There's even a not particularly good photo, but there is a photo of the grave literally on a couple of days after they erected it in the book, which is really an amazing thing to have. But yeah, and still today, even on my journey, when I went to this little town, which is now in Annecy, they still hold a ceremony every August on the day of the crash. And I never knew that growing up. I don't think any of my family did really, but they still really care about this story. And you can see when you go out, you know, how grateful they are. And despite the fact that Frank crashed into their village and killed 5 people and, you know, demolished those houses, they're still so grateful and think that those 6 lads died trying to help them, which is of course what they were doing. But it's so wonderful to know that they still think that. Hopefully it continues.
Gosh, yeah. That's 80 plus years on, you know, it's just so emotive, isn't it? It's so powerful and relevant. But so we talk about Frank's journey now, and he heads towards Switzerland, doesn't he? So can you tell us a little about that journey, and that I believe he faces a dilemma when he gets there as well?
Sure, yeah. So he's so close to Switzerland, this part of France, that's the obvious option for resistance, is to just get him into neutral Switzerland, then decide what to do and come up with a plan to get him back to the UK. So he spends 3 more days in a different safe house, so 6 days total now in France, and then the resistance enacts their plan to get him into Switzerland, which is a great plan. Local 22-year-old attractive blonde woman is going to pretend to be his courting partner, and they're going to be dropped off a couple of miles from the Swiss border and walk hand in hand through the fields to the Swiss border, pretending to be lovers, just going for a stroll. And then once they get to the border, they'll slip under the wire and between the patrols and get into the safety of neutral Switzerland, which given his physical injuries and there's cuts and scars on his face and everything, I think he was dressed up in some local Frenchman sort of outfit and a fedora and a handkerchief to his face, and he had to obviously prop his arm inside of his blazer because it was broken. And anyway, it's boiling hot August heat wave.
Gosh.
And he writes very funnily about walking to the border with this French girl called Colette, and he said it was ghastly, worse than crossing the Dutch coast at 0 feet on a moonlit night, which is a good. But anyway, they walk along and they get to this farmhouse, and the farmer's in the know, and they wait in this farmhouse, and the sun ploughs by this farmhouse. Darkness is falling, big thunderstorm starts, classic in the Alps at that time. And the Italian patrols basically decide they don't want to be outside in the rain because their nice uniform is going to get wet. So they march off, and Frank and Colette go under the wire and into Switzerland. So the immediate danger is past, but in Switzerland, Frank has now got this choice. I mean, he's obviously far from home. His family, his wife and his young baby don't know if he's dead or alive. And also he's feels like it's his duty to carry on with the war, which is why when he's given this choice of whether he should remain in Switzerland with the other interned air crews, or choose to go back into occupied Europe and try and escape, he chooses the escape option, which is obviously much more dangerous. And although technically he, if captured, should be treated as a POW, he'd be making the escape in civilian clothes. And, he'd be running risks of, the Germans basically thinking he could be underground, working for the underground. And, who knows what could have happened to him, basically. Essentially, it was the more dangerous option than just sitting out the war in Switzerland with the other Allied air crews who were there. And so he chooses to escape. But first of all, he's got to recover. And he does spend, I think, a month and a half, 2 months in Geneva, basically in and out of hospital and dentists and various sorts of things, physically recovering and allowing the resistance, who are actually able to talk to London a bit, to try and formulate a plan to get him back to Britain.
So Frank decides to head back into occupied France, as you've said, but there's been a change of management, if you like, hasn't there? And that part of France is now controlled by the Germans, rather than what you describe in the book as the lackluster Italians, which I think is a wonderful description. So can you tell us about the Roche family and their role in Frank's journey? And I'd love to know more about one of the central characters in the book, the incredible Françoise, who's just straight out of a film. She's absolutely magnificent.
Yes, yeah. She in the time that Frank's been in Switzerland, Germany have now occupied the whole of France, including the so-called Free South, Vichy France in the south. So that's a really important point, actually, which I should have made. Frank goes ahead with the plan anyway. They slip over the border from Switzerland back into France, and they're supposed to meet up with a contact who's going to take them to a town outside of Paris, to this specific field where he has to give this code to someone who's then going to give a code to someone else, and then hopefully a Lysander's going to appear out of nowhere and pick him up and take him home. Anyway, they never even make the contact in the border town on the Swiss-French border. It's foggy. They can't find where they're going. Curfews descending, and basically the whole thing falls apart from the very beginning. And so Frank is wandering around this town in the fog with 10 minutes before curfew, thinking, I made the wrong choice here. Luckily, this amazing person, I don't know their name. All I know is they're called Monsieur Roche. And he basically takes Frank in off the street. And he's a policeman, but he's working for the resistors. And he takes Frank in and houses him for a few days, keeps him safe, secure, and rouses his contacts in the resistance, who come up with a new plan to take Frank completely different direction. Rather than going to Paris and Lysander back to England, they're going to go south to the Pyrenees, hopefully cross the Pyrenees into Spain, all the way through Spain to Gibraltar, and fly back from Gibraltar. So it's definitely the much, much longer route. And as we'll find out, didn't quite go to plan all the way. But yeah, crucial intervention by the Roche family there. And sadly, they were one of the families whose descendants I weren't actually able to track down, as I managed to track down nearly all the other descendants of these wonderful French people who saved Frank. Anyway, Frank obviously can't just go down through France on the train by himself. He'd be caught pretty much immediately. Which is where this incredible character Françoise comes in. Françoise is a 62-year-old chain-smoking asthmatic French woman who has no children, advises nothing more than Germans in France, and will do anything to help the Allies and try to liberate France. And she had basically been working in an escape line, in the Pat line, but I think it was summer 1943, the line was pretty much shut down by the Gestapo. Everybody was caught, tortured, shot, deported, awful things. She was one of the only ones who got away, being a 62-year-old French woman who'd wear these incredible disguises. I don't think the Germans, actually I know from a Vichy police report that they considered her mentally unstable, and therefore not able to do clandestine work.
Oh.
So that's why she escaped the Gestapo's clutches. Anyway, she certainly wasn't mentally unstable. She was a credible operator, and she's going to courier Frank across France on the train, basically accompany him, buy the tickets, make sure they sit in the right carriages, say the right things, do the right things, all these little things which you wouldn't think of. Even just the way that French people walk or chew or eat, or just tiny little things which could give you away. Make sure you look the right way when you're crossing the road, something like that. Being a classic one. And she takes Frank on this journey down to Toulouse. Incredible. The tenseness of this journey must have just been awful. At one point, a German officer and his wife actually enter their train carriage, their compartment, and Frank's just sitting there feigning sleep, trying not to have any attention or anything, but just to think of the tension. A second train, when they had to change at some point, they got on the second train and entered a carriage that was unbelievably full of a Luftwaffe aircrew who were on their way, must have been moving somewhere. Again, it's 4 a.m. and they were all asleep, and Frank comes in and pretends to be asleep again. And then when they arrive in the station, they all get out straight away, basically. And obviously, once you've entered the carriage, you can't leave because it would be too suspicious. So then you have to go and sit amongst them. Incredible journey. Somehow they make it. Wouldn't have had a hope in hell without Francoise.
Yeah.
And they arrive in Toulouse, and a new safe house, again, run by another incredible middle-aged woman, this time somebody called Therese, who's half French, half Irish. Again, another incredible character. And she runs the safe house with a iron grip and makes all the airmen, because they've had hundreds of airmen come through, going on to climb the Pyrenees. She makes them all climb the stairs on their tiptoes 20 times in the morning before she serves them breakfast and all sorts of things like that. And anyway, Frank is one of those airmen, and he's actually there at the time with an American airman, a 19-year-old tail gunner who'd been shot down in June and had only just made it to Toulouse. And so they're united in Toulouse, and they're getting ready to hike over the Pyrenees.
Wow. I'm guessing that's Joe you're speaking about?
Yeah, so this guy, he's called Joe Manos. He's a 19-year-old New Yorker, never left New York, let alone America before the war. Yeah, tail gunner, flying fortress, shot down in June.
I'd like to learn a little bit about, because they're traveling together, a little bit about their relationship and how they build it.
Certainly an interesting relationship, I think. Frank's 30-year-old Brit, publicly educated RAF, and Joe's a 19-year-old American New Yorker who's 6'4".
Oh gosh.
And is a teenager straight out of New York. Frank's 30 and 5'9" or whatever he was, average height. So they're pretty much chalk and cheese. And I think they had a very relationship with, given the strain of the surroundings as well, the relationship wasn't great. I don't think they got on particularly well reading between the lines. But most of the arguments and the sort of fracturing of their relationship, I think, happened on this hike over the Pyrenees. Incredibly taxing. They were sort of marching 20 miles a night over, high Pyrenean mountains, through streams, loose boulder scree slopes, really, really tough conditions. I did it myself, and I can say I couldn't keep up with their pace that they set. They crossed in three nights. And it took me 4 full days.
Wow.
They did have a guide in the form of a local Catalan farmer and his family, who basically guided them over the mountains. Yeah, again, more heroic local French people who are just, totally normal, in this case, a farmer, risking their lives to help a random airman from North Wales get back, who they probably never see again. But so that's pretty amazing. But anyway, Joe and Frank, they're hiking over the mountains, and the trouble really starts where the guide leaves them just inside the Spanish border, and he says to them, okay, you're on your own from now on. This is what you need to do. This is where you need to go, and good luck. And they set off, and pretty quickly they're basically having a blazing row about who should be leading and which way they should go. And Frank really wants to rest, and he's got he twisted his knee in a river and he's in pain and he can't keep up with the pace that Joe's setting, and Joe won't wait for him, and they're obviously dog tired and stressed, and Joe's obviously much bigger and younger and fitter, but Frank is technically much senior in rank, but they're in different air forces, and so anyway, I don't think they got on particularly well, and they end up trying to get on a train in a little town in northern Spain called Figueres. Just as they're about to board, Frank feels a hand on his shoulder, and he thinks it's Joe, just nagging him about something again. And he turns around and finds a Franco police officer, fascist police officer, basically holding his pistol, saying, "Come with me." And so they've made it into Spain, technically neutral, technically safe, and they've been arrested, and they're obviously being taken to jail. And it must have been a crushing moment after coming over the Pyrenees and this hard hike and the arguments with Joe, and finally feel like you've made it, and then you get arrested by a supposedly neutral nation and sent to jail. So it must have been a very low point for Frank.
I was quite shocked to read about how badly they were actually treated by the Spanish in Spain after their arrest, and sort of in that various different prisons and what have you. It was quite brutal, wasn't it?
Yeah, terrible, really. Again, another thing I had no idea of really before going out and doing this journey. But yeah, they were treated awfully, and I think from researching it a bit, and basically any airmen who came over the Pyrenees and were caught were locked up as bargaining chips, really. So Spain could have something to negotiate, well, we'll release these prisoners, release these airmen who are obviously desperately needed in the UK. So that's basically what it was. But yeah, they were treated awfully. I mean, Frank was only in jail. He only ended up being in this jail for a week. And everybody who ever spoke to him about his escape said that they got the impression that he was in the jail for the entire 3.5-month escape. Such was the effect it had on him.
Goodness.
And I mean, they were given a ladle full of soup a day and half a piece of bread every other day by the Red Cross. And I think it was 7 men to a tiny cell, all stone, open lavatory in the corner, tiny window facing a courtyard up in the top right. Punishingly cold on the concrete floor, and they'd have these awful bugs that would come down in the night. So they'd be used to right and feet, and completely infested with these awful bugs in the night, so they couldn't sleep. Constantly thirsty. Prison guards basically forced them to pawn everything they owned just for glasses of water. And yeah, really, really awful. And I went to this building. It's like a sort of 18th century kind of military fortress. And I went to this building in Spain where they locked up all these airmen and other political dissidents and French resistance coming over the Pyrenees and stuff. There's absolutely no mention anywhere of its wartime, what happened there in the wartime at all. It's all obviously focuses on the 18th century stuff. But yeah, absolutely nothing at all, literally, and you can't visit the cells, and I just didn't like the place just from the very beginning. And maybe I was predestined not to like it, but we walked around the outside and it was strewn with litter, and the staff weren't very nice, and obviously they missed out this whole war section as well. But it was really weird. The place was horrible. I really didn't like it, and and shocking in my opinion that none of that is mentioned as it should be.
And Frank's eventual journey back to England, that's pretty eventful as well, isn't it?
Yes. So he's released from this jail after a week. Thank God. Basically, the Allies have managed to negotiate for quite a big prisoner release. And travels across Spain. It takes him like another 3 weeks, I think, to get to Gibraltar. Spanish don't do anything quickly. And eventually gets to Gibraltar, British outpost at the bottom of Spain. He's being flown home overnight in the back of a Warwick, flying up the Bay of Biscay. Frank's asleep at 4 or 5 in the morning, thinking of, I'm going to see my family for the first time in 3.5 months and, be back in the UK in a couple of hours, and must have been having these happy dreams. And then suddenly there's a massive explosion and some burning smell fills the air, and Frank jolts awake and is like, "Oh my God, we're being shot down, or we've been bounced, or some flak has come up from a ship or something, and I'm gonna, have to jump out of this aircraft and do this whole bloody thing again, basically." And these, the aircrew are going around handing out parachutes and they're getting ready to jump. Anyway, they don't actually jump, and after a while, the aircraft seems to be performing reasonably, and they carry on. When they come into England, coming into RAF Lynham to land, touchdown, and Frank thinks, right, thank God, it is now over. Until all of a sudden the aircraft starts, this landing gear collapses and the aircraft starts spinning across the runway, and, terrible scraping along the runway, and spins off into the grass and eventually comes to a halt. And I have no doubt that Frank must have been the first person out that door, sprinting across the airfield to safety. Anyway, what had happened is that huge explosion was the aircraft actually being struck by lightning, and it had burnt the catches holding the nose cone in place. So it was just being held there. The nose cone was being held there by air pressure. And then once the aircraft started to slow on landing, the nose cone fell off and dislodged all the landing gear, and the aircraft went spinning away. So again, Frank has survived another not particularly safe landing, but I can't decide if he is the luckiest person in the world or the most unlucky.
I'd have to put you off flying forever, but I guess that's not what you continued in the RAF, didn't it? Now, I'm interested to hear about your own journey, Adam, and how you recreated Frank's route. As a historian, I understand how important it is to actually walk the ground, but you walked, hiked, climbed, and camped in it, didn't you? It sounds like an absolutely incredible adventure, and I love how you sort of interwove your own journey along with Frank's journey in the book. It must have been a very emotional experience for you as well, though, as well as a physically hard one.
Yes, it was. Absolutely. Yeah, and then I've alluded to it a couple of times, but fast forward 80 years, I go out and retrace his journey. And as I said, I was going out to write 1,000-word article. But I guess what really changed all of that and actually led to the book and writing it all down properly was doing the journey, and most importantly, meeting descendants of people who had saved Frank, which I was just totally blown away by our meetings. And these total strangers, complete strangers in France, never met them before, literally rocked up on their doorstep. I don't really speak French. They didn't really speak English. And yet we still would talk for, sit down and talk for sort of 3 hours constantly. And you could just see how bursting with pride they were and how glowing they were to be talking about this story, and how much information had been passed down to them, and clearly how important it was a story in their family, just as it was in mine. In fact, I actually think on reflection that it's more important to them than it is to me, because obviously in the UK we can kind of assume all of our ancestors were on the right side in the Second World War, and in France you really can't, especially occupied. Huge chunks of France collaborated with the Germans and did some really terrible things, and helped round up Jews and really assisted the German war machine. So you can't in France know that your ancestors are on the right side. So I think for these people who I met, to know that was so powerful for them. And yeah, I mean, just to give you a few examples, I mean, there was one lady I met who was 80, and she actually has the honor of being the only person who's still alive from when Frank passed through. So she was a 6-month-old baby when Frank passed through. And I met her, and I walked into her flat, and as soon as she saw me, she just gasped and put her hands to her face and just immediately started crying. And I was so overwhelmed by it. And then one of the first things she told me was that when Frank came to her home, see her mother's home at the time, in the war, he used to hold her in his arms and think of his own baby at home, who was also 6 months old at the time, who was my granny, who I obviously remember incredibly well. And just like things like that. And I was struggling to struggling to keep it together at points like that. And I just didn't expect it. I don't know how, you can't really prepare yourself for those kind of things. And like on the Swiss border, give another example, that farmhouse where the farmer was in the know, who kind of helped them cross into Switzerland. I met the farmer's descendants in the very place where they crossed into Switzerland. which was really cool. And the farmhouse is still there. And obviously farmers don't really move, so they're still there. And I remember asking her, about what else her great grandfather had done in the war. And he'd helped Jewish school children cross over into Switzerland and other resistance fighters and like secret messages and all sorts of stuff. And then I remember she just turned to me and was like, but he only helped one RAF pilot in the war. And he always maintained that was his greatest honor. That was his family's greatest honor, to have helped an RAF pilot in the war. And I was just there like, my God, this is absolutely incredible. I can't believe these people, are out here and that they think these things, and that like my family don't even know this.
Yeah.
We didn't know that this little village are like so appreciative of those airmen dying to try to help them. And again, I had more and more meetings like this across France. So yeah, really an incredible meeting, an incredible trip. And I guess it is when I came home, I was just like, right, I just have to write everything down. I didn't know idea what an agent was or a book or anything about publishing. But I just wrote it all down, and then by happy flukes ended up with the book. But yeah, it was a wonderful trip. So glad I did it.
Well, that leads on to the next question. As you said, you've met these people, you've met the families, the relatives and such. I've been on this incredible journey, and it sounds certainly a very emotive fun. And then you come to write it. I mean, how did that directly influence you in the way you wanted to tell this story and write the book?
I guess the main overarching thing from the very beginning was I realized that I'd gone out to retrace Frank, and obviously he was the RAF pilot hero and survived the war and everything and did all these amazing things. But when I, very quickly became obvious that, okay, these French people were risking so much more and were so brave and heroic. If you remember that 14-year-old boy on the bike, the very first person he made contact with, one of his mates, another 14-year-old boy, helped push Frank on this bike up to the safe house. He was arrested by the Gestapo and tortured and killed. 14-year-old boy. So the bravery of these French people was obviously even more so than Frank's, I think. So I always wanted to make sure that their stories were, try to tell them as much as possible. And I guess for the contemporary element of my retracing, I'm glad, Jane, you thought they flowed together all right, because I was worried that was going to be like jumping around in time and stuff like that. So that's very kind of you. Yeah, I just love the contemporary element. I mean, 80 years, this has happened 80 years ago. So all these people are dead now, and nearly everyone in the Second World War was dead now. So I thought it was just a nice thing, especially with this contemporary element, to show how these stories are still so powerful and so important and worth telling, not only because they're really exciting and funny and tragic and just amazing, but because obviously we should never forget them. And, just like we should never forget Frank, and we should never forget that 14-year-old boy, because obviously we can't ever let another Second World War happen again.
Yeah.
Well, Adam, I have to say that you've really done both your great-grandfather and the people who helped him. You've really done them justice in this book. It is a wonderful book, and I highly recommend it to our listeners. And I have to say, I did cry at the end. That's not news for anybody who knows me, because I cry.
That's not news.
Yeah,
that's not news.
That's not news. But yeah, it was lovely. I found it very affecting and beautifully written as well. And considering this is your first book, it's so beautifully written. It really is. I look forward to reading your future work as well. Yeah, it was lovely. I really, really enjoyed reading it. So thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Jay. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're most welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your story with us, Adam. I'll put the links to the book in the show notes so that people can know where to find it. But yeah, it's highly recommended, and it's a beautiful story. It really is. I think it's a story that really sort of restores your faith in humanity, I think. Yeah, that's my opinion anyway. But
absolutely, yeah.
So thanks, Adam.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. That was amazing. Thank you ever so much.
No, thank you both for inviting me. Yeah.
So if you've enjoyed this podcast, which I have especially enjoyed this episode, one of the best things you could do is leave us a quick rating or review on your favorite podcast platform. It only takes a moment, but it makes a massive difference in helping new listeners discover Never Mind the Dam Busters and the incredible stories like this one. For those who'd like to go a step further, you can support the show from £2.40 or $3 a month. Your contribution helps cover hosting and recording costs, and basically keeps the podcast flowing. You'll find the link in the show notes or at nevermindthedambusters.buzzsprout.com. We'd also love to hear from you, so join the conversation in our Facebook group or connect with us via social media. Again, thank you for listening. We'll return next week with more stories and insights into the world of RAF Bomber Command. Until then, take care and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.